story. A lot of people aren't aware, well, maybe a lot is maybe saying a bit much, but many people are not really aware of the history that even comes out of the country where my parents come from, and they're from Jamaica. So if you want to just show your hand if you know the history of the Jews of Jamaica. Not bad. Not bad. It is a rich, rich history. And I think to understand where I come from, and actually a story that is not just my story, but it's all of our stories. The history of Jews throughout the world is a story that belongs to all of us. So I do have a presentation, a slide presentation, and I will go through it at a fair clip because I want to leave some room for discussion. And please, please, please feel free to comment as I go along, because for me, it's great when people speak in the moment instead of like, because I find as I get older and older, I'm not so great on holding on to the question to the end unless I write it down. So feel free to interject. So I'm going to try and screen share, which for some reason, after all these months of Zoom, you'd think I'd be good at it by now, but not necessarily. So can you see that? Can somebody, oh, perfect. Wow, I must be getting better. Okay, so Jewish diversity. The Jews of the Caribbean, and I think when I started to delve more and more into my history, this just actually boggled my mind. So the Jewish settlement in the Caribbean preceded Jewish settlement in North America. And when we talk about the Caribbean, they also include like Curacao, they include parts of South America, parts of Central America, and so on. So it's a broad definition of the Caribbean, but even just that whole concept of understanding, because right now when we think of Jews on this side of our planet, we think of North America. We think of, New York. We think of Montreal. We think of Toronto. We think of all these big places, not recognizing that for almost 200 years, Jewish life in the New World was centered in the Caribbean, and most were from Western Sephardim. There were more Jews in Curacao at that time in the 17th and 18th century than in New York, Newport, Philadelphia, and Savannah combined. So those are the hubs of Jewish life. And there were still more Jews in Curacao than in all of those places combined. And the Caribbean, so the Jews often from the Caribbean, they were the ones who hopped over to North America and settled North America. And one interesting fact, there's this newspaper in Waco, Texas called the Texas Herald, and that was founded by two Jamaican Jews. De Cordova is it's one of the more common Jamaican Jewish last names. And I can't remember what state it is, but there is a state who has the motto that is very similar to Jamaica out of many one. So it's kind of interesting. And I'd like to argue that it's not that it didn't go from the US to Jamaica, it went from Jamaica to the US, that saying. So how did my people get there? Spanish Inquisition and expulsion. Convert, die, get out. So my people were kicked out and ended up traveling over with Christopher Columbus and discovered Jamaica. And I use that term loosely because it was always there, but discovered Jamaica. And of course, the Portuguese expulsion also. One of the things about it too is that, and I'll get into a little bit further, but when Columbus discovered Jamaica on his second voyage, one of the things that the king and queen did was they gave the country, so to speak, to the Columbus family. And because of that, it was actually really fortuitous. Because of that gift, Columbus's grandson allowed conversos to settle on the island, and then they were therefore free from the Inquisition. In fact, the Inquisition lasted about 340 years in different countries that were under Spanish rule, but never in Jamaica. It was Inquisition free. Around the mid 1600s, however, because, when things are going great, somehow something gets messed up. They didn't want to keep Jamaica's Inquisition free. So the Spanish actually threatened to impose the Inquisition on Jamaica. When word of that obviously hit the people, especially the Jews, they were like, we can't do this. We've been living safely, not openly necessarily as Jews, but at least not under the threat of death. And so they went and approached England and petitioned England and said, look, if we help you conquer Jamaica for England, will you allow us to continue as is? And a deal was set. They helped Oliver Cromwell take over Jamaica for England. So that's when it switched from a Spanish colony and became an English colony. And once that happened, another great thing happened is now the conversos, or the new Christians, could now openly practice Judaism. So that became a time period where things started to flourish in the communities. So synagogues were built. You could, whatever you can possibly think of that you would have in a Jewish community they were now able to do it out in the open. And also, the Jews of Jamaica were granted citizenship in 1660 by King Charles. And because now Jamaica was deemed a safe place, other Jews started to flock to Jamaica. So they started to flock from France and Britain, and of course in Spain and Portugal, because they were able to now escape anti-Semitism and persecution. And like I just said, now able to build synagogues and fully participate in religious activities. The Port Royal, the Spanish town still has quite a few Jews, as does Kingston. Port Royal was a place where it was kind of a hub for pirates. And I'll touch briefly on Jamaican Jewish pirates because that is a thing. In fact, I used to work with Rabbi Goldstein, and when she was hearing about the history of my family, she laughed and she said, you know, I have this feeling you are a direct descendant of a pirate. And I remember thinking to myself, is that a good thing? I took it as a compliment. I took it as a compliment. It's like, okay, cool, I'll accept that. The good thing too, in Jamaica, there was a hierarchy, especially back then. So you can picture at the top were Christian whites. They were at the top. It's British colony, Christian whites are at the top. Jews had almost as much privilege as Christian whites. At the bottom would be the native population, some of which would have been slaves. But Jews had almost as much privilege as Christian whites. However, when I say almost, here's the thing. We were still denied full political rights. And what they established was something that was colloquially called the Jew tax. And the way they justified this extra tax was that they needed to tax Jews in order to raise money for the country's defense, which clearly wasn't the rationale. The story more was, as they saw that we started to get more involved in economics and get more involved in the communities and building Jamaica, there was a resentment of those who felt that we were taking over. And they actually petitioned to have this extra tax. And that's how they couched it, was as to raise money for the defense of the country. So really, in 1700, 5%, because that's what we were, 5% of the population was expected to pay 17% of the tax burden. One of the primary families, Delgado family, Moses in particular, had an issue with this. And so he pushed it with the British and pushed it and pushed it. And so finally in 1831, we had full civil rights and all that encompassed. And it's interesting to note that we in Jamaica, Jews in Jamaica in 1831 had full civil rights. In Canada, it was a year later. In England, it was even later than that. And so to me, that is exceptional that Jews received full civil rights even before the UK, of which Jamaica was a colony. By 1849, 8 of the 47 members of the House of Assembly were Jews. In fact, and then it grew. In fact, there was enough of an impact that the House did adjourn on Yom Kippur. The economy, we primarily were involved in sugar and vanilla industries, foreign trade, shipping. There are still places in Jamaica that were either designed by a Jewish architect or somehow we were involved in the building of it. One of the places is Devonshire House. And I always forget what it used to be. Right now it's a fantastic place to get ice cream, but it's an amazing structure. And I was there, I took my equal other, Yoram, there to Jamaica. He's been many times before, but this was our first trip, and it was probably about 4 years ago. And I was filming bits of Jewish Jamaica. So we rented a vehicle. Well, we had a driver because I would never drive in Jamaica. That's just crazy. And he took us all the way to Kingston. And on our way back, Yoram said, you know, I keep seeing this name everywhere, this Matalon name. He says, I see it on construction sites. I see it here and there. And he says, I'm pretty sure that's like a Sephardi name. He says, that's a very Sephardi Jewish name. And I said, yeah, it's the Matalon family. They're a prominent family in Jamaica. In fact, sadly, the matriarch had just passed away on that trip I was on. But then our driver said, he goes, oh, they're Jewish? And he said, yeah. I said, it's a big Jewish family. He says, oh, yeah. He says, they build housing developments. He says, they're an amazing family. And so you still see the influence of us there. The paper, the Gleaner is probably the equivalent of the National Post. It's a national newspaper. And it still exists today, and you can actually pick up copies of it in Toronto. And that was started by the De Cordovas. And if you remember that name, they're the ones who also started the paper in Texas. And the Gleaner is still kicking and still alive and well. This is a question that comes up, and here's my thought on this. Everybody's history, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, there are parts of our history that sometimes we're not too proud of. And when you look back on that history with the lens of 2020, which is probably not a good lens because it was a really bad year, but when you look back on the lens of 2020, yeah, you see how flawed it was. Back then, it was the norm. And I said to people, I said, we need to own the fact that as Jews, some of us did have slaves. But we have to also see it in the context of then, and understand that while we were slave owners, we weren't majority slave owners. So I say to people, I said, you know, it's not a great history, but it's 3.6% of the people who were shareholders in the slave trade, and so then the total was 11 of those, which is 3%, and it is what it is, you know? So here's my favorite part. Jamaican Jewish pirates. There's a great book called Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, and I recommend it to everyone. It not just discusses the history, obviously the focus is about that history, but in telling the story, it tells you a lot about the Jewish history of the Caribbean in general, how we got there, what we did, everything. So it's a fantastic book. There is a very familiar last name in Jamaica, Enriquez. In the Enriquez family, all of us Jews of Jamaican descent owe quite a lot to the Enriquez family because they've maintained our history. They've made sure that our records are intact and in one place. When we couldn't have a rabbi in the synagogue, they ensured that they continued as lay leaders and made sure that the community wouldn't completely disappear. They managed the museums. It's a very prominent, wonderful family. The two that I haven't met Ainsley, who's sort of like the patriarch, but I've definitely met his cousin Stephen, and just incredible wealth of knowledge and love for not just Jamaica, but just love of Judaism. Just amazing people. So this is one of their direct ancestors. So Antonio Enriquez, He used to be, he was a prominent merchant, but he was in Lisbon, but he was also a secret Jew. And he was publicly tortured along with other Jews for the crime of being Jewish and practicing Judaism. So he escaped to Amsterdam. And while he was there, he became a public Jew. So he underwent all of circumcision. He changed his name to Abraham Enriquez Cohen and publicly said, I am a Jew. The other part of him, though, is he was a pirate. And he teamed up with Sir Henry Morgan, and yes, Sir Henry Morgan of the Rum. And together, they did one of the largest theft in the history of the Spanish Armada. And a little thing about the way the pirates operated. Not only did they operate under the wish for money, you know, for greed or whatever, but they deliberately targeted Spanish and Portuguese ships. So there was the component of wealth, but there was also the component of revenge in who they specifically targeted. Now, Sir Henry Morgan was made Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, and he pardoned his friend, the pirate. Any questions so far? I can't see all of you, so you'd have to unmute and just say what you'd like. And hearing nothing, I shall continue. The 20th century, this is a history that I really, and I still haven't corrected my typo. This is a history that I know that is not that familiar. There, we know the story about the St. Louis, the ship that was turned away, right? Turned away in the US, turned away in Canada. But not a lot of us know about the history of the Serpa Pinto, which also had Jewish refugees escaping from Eastern Europe, from Germany, from Poland. And when they asked for permission to go to Jamaica, and Jamaica said yes. And so because of that, Jamaica was able to save hundreds of Jewish refugees and other refugees from Nazi Germany. They had a settlement area, and it was called, there was two of them. There was Gibraltar 1 and Gibraltar 2. Gibraltar 2 mainly held Jewish refugees, and it had everything. And they had access to everything: education, hospitals, synagogue, everything. And that's where they spent the time, not just during the war, but for several years, in some cases, decades. In some cases, their descendants still live in Jamaica, but quite a few ended up leaving Jamaica and going to either Israel or to the US or to Canada. But for me, this is an amazing piece of our history that we need to know about. This is a story of saving us from sheer death, and they did not. And Jamaica is a small island. It's a small island. And now Gibraltar, where they were, is now actually part of the campus for the university, but you can still go there because there's still pictures and there's still a tribute to that place in itself. In terms of religious affiliation, right now it's deemed as progressive. Initially, it was definitely Orthodox. If you know, the minhag of Sephardim to this day is kind of like, if you're going to compare it to anything, you compare it to Orthodoxy. So separate seating, all that stuff. And it was that way for a long time. It wasn't until the 70s that they actually changed and started to have less Hebrew, more English, and become a bit more progressive, so to speak. That's their terminology. Having said that, there are two rules that will never change. So in order to have a Jewish marriage, it has to be a Jew marrying a Jew, and also to be buried in any of the two existing cemeteries, you must be Jewish. People always ask me well, how many Jews are in Jamaica? You know, how many? And it's funny, if you Google it, the number that always comes up is 200. And those of us who are either Jamaican Jews or Jews of Jamaican descent, we always laugh. We say, what is with this number, this 200? You asked that question 60 years ago, that's 200. You probably ask that question 60 years from now, and there'll still be this weird number, 200. My thinking is it's of the only synagogue, 200 of those 200, there are 200 members. So I think that is what they're saying is when they say 200, because actually when they did and I have to get this citation, I keep forgetting to add it, but when they did do a survey and they said over 20,000 Jews in Jamaica, 20,000 Jamaicans identify as Jews. So that's a grossly different number from 200 to 20,000. And it's perceived that possibly almost 500,000 Jamaicans are descendants of Jewish immigrants to Jamaica. And you will see it. You'll see it in last names of De Silva, Lindo. There's an actor named Delroy Lindo. And every time I see his name, I think, do you know your history? So when I see these names, I instantly think Jamaica. Enriquez. It's just one of those things. And there are a lot of Jamaicans running around with these last names. Sangster is actually the name of the airport in Kingston. I said it was a flourishing community. At one point, there was 21 cemeteries. Now there's only 2. Not in, the other 19 are in various stages of, they need a lot of repair. And every now and then a group gets together and they'll go to the island and try and clean it up and restore it and so on. Like I said previously, when I was talking about when Jews were able to openly practice Judaism in Jamaica, everything that you could picture here in Toronto, they also had in Jamaica. So Hillel, which they still have, chapters of B'nai B'rith, all that stuff was in Jamaica. And now there is actually Chabad. And it's an interesting story behind Chabad. Jamaica's always had a problem keeping a rabbi. We had, over the years, of course, rabbis. Then we didn't have a rabbi for the longest time. Then we had a rabbi who came in from the United States. I don't know, I can't even remember how long he stayed. And then he left. But Chabad would always try and come and stay in Jamaica. But they would stay for a little bit and then they'd leave. And when I was there 4 or 5 years ago, I heard that Chabad was there and they were staying. So I went to Montego Bay to see what's going on. And I met Rabbi Raskin, who actually is originally from Montreal. And I said to him, I said, why are you still here? Like, why haven't you bolted like everybody else? And he said, the problem that they were having was all about kosher food. And he said, not even just kosher food, kosher meat in particular. And he said it was a struggle. So they just left. And I said, well, how did you resolve it? Because you're still here. He said, it was actually easy. He said, I have it sent in from Florida. Because Florida is a very short plane ride. He says, I just have it sent in from Florida, done. And so I said to him, I said, so you're never leaving? He says, no. He says, it will be very difficult to get me and my wife to leave now at this point because they love it. He even tries to speak Jamaican patois, which is the most interesting thing coming out of his mouth when he's like, yeah, man, how you doing, Rivka? Yeah, man. And I just look at him with like kind of shock. It's like, really, Rabbi? But he's doing a fantastic job. And when he first landed in Montego Bay, he was like, oh, we won't find anyone. Maybe we'll find a couple of Jews here and there, or the Jews from Kingston. He said within a short period of time, I think it was like 3 or 4 months, 16 families came out of the woodwork and found his restaurant and said, oh, this is great. He was in shock because he really, not 16 people, 16 families. And what he does is he will, when cruise ships come in, he'll, wander over, see if there's any Jews there, he will go to different hotels. If he finds out, he did it with me. He said, so what hotel are you staying at? And so I told him, he says, okay, good. I have a connection. You need to get me in there. Like he's very resourceful. He's amazing. And so every time I go back, I definitely make a point of going and visiting him. And there he is. He's a gentleman. Clearly, he's the gentleman on the left. So that's Rabbi Raskin, the patois-speaking Jamaican rabbi. And that's Yoram, my equal other, and that's myself. Yoram he's Israeli, and the last time he put on tefillin was when he was bar mitzvahed. And so here, whoops, oh my goodness, I went too fast. And there he is. That was the first time since his bar mitzvah. You put on tefillin, and what a place to put it on. Like, what a place. All right. I'll just brush over this. The synagogue, there is one synagogue. There used to be multiple synagogues. And it's funny, at one point on one street in Jamaica, in Kingston, there were 3 synagogues. And you know that saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions? That's all I could think of. I was like, 3 synagogues? Why would you? I get to maybe a Sephardi synagogue and Ashkenaz. What is the third one, right? If it's like, you know, two synagogues, three synagogues, why not? We are one of 5 synagogues with a sand floor. We also like to say we're the oldest synagogue. I think Curacao actually beat us out on that. But nonetheless, we have a sand floor, beautiful memorial gardens, which I have some pictures of, and I'll just flip through that. So this is a synagogue, and excuse the pictures. I think it was like 90 degrees and humid. So I had a hard time taking pictures because I just wanted it to be done. So that's why they're a little off center, and I never did edit them. But you can see it's gorgeous, beautiful building. Beautiful. And the memorial gardens, there's that, the Star of David, there's the bench. Nope. This flipped is a tombstone with the Kohanim symbol. This is Stephen Enriquez, amazing. And where he is right now is there's a museum attached to the synagogue. And in the museum, along the walls, they have all the presidents that ever existed. They have a letter from Golda Meir saying hello to the Jamaican Jewish community. It's a wealth of stuff. It has this chair for the Brit Milah. They have, at last count when I was there, they may even have more, they had 13 Torah scrolls, 13. And I said to Stephen, I said, how do you accumulate 13? He said, because people hear about our community and they give us Torahs. I'm like, he goes, they keep giving us Torah scrolls. And he says, who are we going to, we're not going to say no. So they have 13 of them. It's amazing. There's just a stock photo, but that's the Bima stock photo. This is one of the cemeteries that is still active. And that's it. And it's actually not, it's a bit of a drive, but not too far. Skip that. And that's all she wrote on that. So let me stop share. Let me take a breath and have a drink of water. Anyone have any questions about our history? Because I know I went through it really fast.
Are you going to tell us about your history?
Oh, of course I am. Of course I am. Okay.
Pauline actually had a question. Pauline has to unmute.
I have seen that name. Not as common as the other ones, but I have seen that name. Pauline, did you want to say? Oh, here.
Hello?
Yes.
I worked for a gentleman. His last name was Andrade, and he was Jamaican, and he had history of being Jewish. But unfortunately, he didn't keep the faith of Judaism.
Yeah. There was one of the things about Jamaica too, you know, we almost take that out of they almost took it too broadly. So there was quite a bit of intermarriage also.
Right.
Yeah, quite a lot. But the community is growing again. It's growing again through conversion, it's growing again through immigration. I remember reading an article about Israelis moving to Jamaica. The climate is similar. It's, you know,
right.
Yeah. So I've heard about that the Israeli community has fallen in love with it. I know when I go to Israel, they ask me a lot of questions about Jamaica, and I think it's all tied into Bob Marley, but nonetheless, and Israelis' love of reggae. But whatever, works for me. One of Bob Marley's sons married an Israeli Jewish woman. So he goes back and forth to Israel a lot himself. But my history, I am the daughter of a Jamaican Jew. And that history is part of my direct history. I was raised as just me, like not religious at all. It wasn't until after I got divorced that I realized that I wanted my kids to know more about who they were, have more of an understanding of who they were as Jews than I did. And so it was really important to me. And that's when I threw myself into our community. And, you know, we started going to synagogue. We actually went to Beth Tzedek on a regular basis, like, you know, and took the walk from Bathurst and Lawrence all the way, like on a regular. And they were in supplementary Hebrew school. And because I wanted to, I felt, well, you understand it. I really wanted to have them have a great sense of their Jewish identity. It became really important to me because I felt I had missed out on that. But then with that came, there was some grief with that, you know, and this is the candid part, and it might feel uncomfortable also for me too. So, you know, going into the community, you really start to understand that you are different. You know, and I use this phrase, we are a minority as Jewish people. I felt like a minority within our minority. And I started to realize that I felt that I always had to justify and to explain to people how I belonged in a place that I belong. And I liken it to, we're a family, right? We're a mishpacha, we're a family. And I likened it to, if you had a family of 4 kids, and every day they go to come home, but the one child who may be a redhead, you look at that child and you're like, I'm not so sure if you're my child. So you have to prove to me that you are my child because you have this red hair and we're all brunettes. So every time you come to our door, you have to prove that you belong in our house, that you are part of this family. And that's what it would feel like. It would feel like, and it didn't matter the space. It could be a synagogue space. It could be an event that I'm going to. It was even a restaurant I went to. So I went to this restaurant that my kids used to go to a lot to get pizza. And I decided this time I was going to go and pick up my slice of cheese pizza and not send my children. So I walk to this restaurant and I go and I stand at the counter and I say, may I have a slice of cheese pizza? And the person looked at me and said, well, you know, it's kosher, right? And I looked at them and I said, well, I hope so, because that's why I'm here. And I said, and I also hope that you're asking all the other people in line the same question. What I also wanted to add, but by then it's like sometimes, you know, you better just stop talking. What I also wanted to say is, what does it matter to you? I'm paying for the pizza. So what does it matter to you whether I know if it's kosher or not? My money is kosher, I can tell you that much. You know, like, it's like, are you kidding me right now? And those are those things that, you know, there's a fancy word for it now, right? They call it microaggressions. It's a fancy word. And I like to tear down that fancy word and put it in simple terms. Picture yourself camping or something, or outside in the summertime, and you're being bitten constantly by mosquitoes. Initially, when it starts, you brush them off. You know, you find yourself slapping them and you move on. You continue with your fire and you're trying to enjoy yourself and you just kind of brush them off. But imagine that it's so much that you finally say, I can't take this anymore. I'm going inside. And that's how the microaggressions worked for some people in the community who looked like me. They felt that they were constantly being bitten by, and at first they would be like, okay, or I'll spray something and I'll try and, you know, manage. But it got to the point where they said, I can't deal with this anymore. So when people say to me, how many Jews of color? And the term Jews of color doesn't necessarily mean Jews that just look like me, you know, Black Jews, Ethiopian Jews, because I get that a lot. You know, are you Ethiopian? I'm like, Ethiopians aren't the only Black Jews. Okay, so no. But thank you, but no. But, you know, the broad definition of Jews are Jews whose ancestry or where they're from are Latin American countries, African countries, Southeast Asian countries, and Asian Middle Eastern countries. and North African or whomever, because North African Sephardi Jews, some self-identify as Jews of color, some do not. Everybody has a right to self-identify however they wish. When you pull in all those numbers, though, you can appreciate that goes from maybe what you may think in your head is like, oh, maybe 10% of Jews look like Rivka, to more like maybe it's 25% of Jews who are Jews of color. It kind of bumps that number. And I have heard stories from Jews who identify as Jews of color who don't necessarily look like me, who say, yes, I also sometimes feel othered. And they are othered in ways that maybe sometimes we don't even realize. I'll give you an example. When I go to synagogue, and this is the right of any synagogue, especially a synagogue that defines itself as Ashkenazi, but when I go in and I hear, Good Shabbos, Good Shabbos. For me, I'm used to hearing Good Shabbos, but my minhag is not, or what I would say is not Good Shabbos. I would say Shabbat Shalom, right? And think about Jews from places that, other than Eastern European, they would not say Good Shabbos. So when you already hear that, you're already declaring what is the primary focus, right? Or Good Yantif, or, these things that we say without really thinking, well, that's what I say, but it's not necessarily what they say, but we're all Jews. And we have to be mindful of that. There's this Jewish experience line that some people sometimes do as part of an exercise in diversity. And there are questions in there like, if you go to synagogue, do you hear tunes that are familiar to you? And, and I'll sit there and I'll think, and I'll think to myself, because I am actually Sephardi despite my very non-religious upbringing. So if we just say, do I hear Sephardi tunes? If I go to Sephardi shul, of course, right? But we don't really mix it up. And we tend to, and it's just how it's happened, is we do tend to focus on a certain group of us within Judaism as this is who we are, this is how we look, and this is what we do. And we don't realize that we have Persian Jews who do something different, eat different foods. We have this rich diversity that we should bring into all of our Jewish selves and all of our Jewish lives. And one of the things that I did, I think I shocked Beit Reim a little bit, because when I started, it was after the high holidays last year. So the next thing there was Hanukkah, but the next thing that was coming up was Purim and the Mishloach Manot. And so there was this big thing about, what are we going to put in this basket? And I said to the president, I am doing a Jewish diversity basket. And he's like, oh, what? I said, a Jewish diversity basket. I said, I'm going to put in things that are from different countries, spices, whether it's shakshuka spice, and I said, a little bit hot pepper sauce, because, Jamaicans, hot pepper sauce. And I said, just little things. And I said, we'll do a booklet that will tell stories of Jews from different countries, and so on, right? Just represent all of us. And in doing that basket, and when it got out, I had congregants who contacted me and said, hey, my family is from Iraq, or my family is from here, or my family is from there. And they said it was super cool that you mentioned it, you highlighted it. And I remember this from when I was a kid, I remember this food. But I had to laugh, and he won't mind me sharing this story. But when I was showing him the basket, and I was so happy, I was so excited, and showing him all these things, and he looked at me and he says, but Rivka, where's the regular food? I said, no, you didn't. I said, this is regular food. I said, it may not be your regular food, but it's somebody's regular food. And he just laughed. He said, okay, you got me. So it's important. Like that's part of, we like to be welcoming. You don't have to be that extreme. And I'm going to copyright my Mishloach Manot, my Jewish diversity. You have to get, my permit. No, I'm just kidding. But there are little things that you can be mindful of, in my experience, I've gone into places where instead of saying, hey, how are you? Or here's a thought, whether it's good Shabbos or Shabbat Shalom, I've actually walked into a synagogue space and have had none of that said to me. I've had people look at me and look away. I've had people actually say to me, do you know where you are? You know, which, think about it. It sounds ludicrous, but it's happened to me, where I've just been just like, okay, don't say anything. Just say yes. Just say yes or turn and walk away. You know, I've had these questions that you would think, you know, even sometimes I can't believe I've had these questions, but I have. And when the last synagogue I worked at, and I'll share this story because it has been shared, I was introduced to the congregation one Shabbat. Afterwards, you know, we were all hanging out, and one of the congregants came up to me, introduced himself, and then said, so, what's your story? I was like, what? What's your story? I said, okay. I said, I was born of a Jewish mom at Women's College Hospital in Toronto in 1965. And I wanted to start to say more. He turned around and took off. And I remember thinking to myself, what did you want to hear? I was found by a nice Jewish family living in my dusty hut in the pit of Africa, and they dragged me out, dusted me off, and brought me to synagogue. Like, what did you want to hear? You know, because I look like this, the story should be bigger or different or sexier than I was born of a Jewish mother. They wanted to hear more, and not that there's anything wrong with anybody else's story. There is never anything wrong with anybody, but don't assume that the story that you have in your mind, because of how I present, is the story of me. Never make that assumption. And, you know, I was at a conference, and this is my favorite. So I have a good friend, Nadia, and she's given me permission to say this story. So Nadia is a convert, but Nadia does not look like me. And we went to this conference, this Jewish conference, and they had a Friday night service. I was actually reluctant to go. There were a lot of people there, and I think I was one of maybe 3 Jews of color at approximately 6,000 people Jewish conference. I just wanted to just be. But Nadia's like, no, come. So I said, okay, fine. And they said, by way of introduction, turn around and say hello to the, like, say, wish, you know, Shabbat Shalom to the person behind you, and tell them your Hebrew name. Okay? So Nadia and I look at each other, and we just, you know, exchange the look that only 2 people who know each other very well can do. So Nadia went first, and she said, I'm Batya Bat Avraham Sarah. Okay? And he looked at me, and I could see it. He was like, just waiting. And I said, I'm Rivka Ruth Bat Shirley. And that's it. And his face was just like, not Sarah, not Abraham, just no, my mother's name, right? And Nadia and I just smiled and left this man just literally staring at me. And Nadia said, now I see it. She said, I see what you say. She said, I knew he expected the names to be switched around. She said, 100%, and you shocked him. I said, hey, that's what I'm here for. But, you know, so those are just some of the things. But I've had some great stories. There's ways to ask the question, and I'll give you an example of ways to ask the question. I am a Jewish woman. I love Jewish geography. Love it. I love it when people say, oh, I'm from here, or my family knows here, and I love it. So I get the need, the feeling of wanting to ask questions. I get that. But what I say is, as tempting as it is, allow the person to share first, okay? Or here's a thought too. You share your story first. And maybe that person will say, okay, cool, I feel a little more comfortable because I'm not putting only myself out there. You're also putting yourself out there. And think about the context and why you're asking. Probably not when I walk into a synagogue. It's probably not a good question, not a good time to ask me if I'm Jewish, did I convert, was I born? Not all those questions. Probably not a good time. Probably, start with ask me my name. like it's probably not a good time. I went to a wedding in Montreal. It was Yoram's family, and part of his family are Chabad. And so it was his cousin marrying a lovely Moroccan woman. Actually, it was beautiful. But on the way to Montreal, I was a bundle of nerves for two reasons. Because of how my level of comfort sometimes within the community, especially going into different spaces, I was a little nervous on that. And I was also nervous because I'm meeting now a whole bunch of his family all in one fell swoop. That's enough to make anybody nervous, right? So we find the place, we find the synagogue, we enter, we separate, and I'm hanging out with the female cousins, three of which I did know very well. And so we're hanging out, having a great time. One of the family members from the bride's side came over and sat. She plunked herself in front of me and went in really close. And so I knew, oh, here it comes, right? And she looked at me and she says, so? I said, hi. She says, hi. She says, so how are you related? I said, oh, I'm sort of a cousin. And you know what she did? She smiled and said, okay, that's cool. And off she went. That was it. She was just curious as to how I was related. Never took it a step further. Gets even better. The place was super hot. There was lots of dancing and I was super, plus I was in here to here. I was I was practically wearing a blanket. I was super hot. So I go outside to get some fresh air. And I'm standing next to this gentleman. And he turns to me and he introduces himself to me. So I introduce myself to him. And then he says to me, he says, oh yeah, he says, I'm from Montreal. I was born in Montreal. And he tells me a bit about his family history. And he says, and what about you? And I said, well, I was actually born in Toronto. I said, but my family are from Jamaica. And then he starts talking about Jamaica because he used to go to Jamaica a lot, back and forth. And he says, yes, he says, and he says to me, there are a lot of Jews in Jamaica. And he starts telling me the history of Jews in Jamaica. And what did I glean from that? He knew how to get out the story without making me feel uncomfortable by sharing a bit of him. He also went by the assumption that I was Jewish because he started saying, because the way he said, yeah, there's a lot of Jews in Jamaica. That says, of course you're from, he didn't even question it one bit. Great way to do it. Beautiful way to do it. And I'll tell you another way to do it, then I'll pause and you can fire some questions before I get into heavier stuff. I used to work at Northwick General Hospital, and our clientele at Northwick General Hospital, it's a large Jewish clientele at Northwick General Hospital. And this is one of my absolute favorite stories. I was charge nurse that day, and I worked in the emerge. And we had a critical patient coming into the resuscitation room. And we had patients in the resuscitation room who could be safely moved out. They were stable. So I ran into the resuscitation room. So now this little bit was like TV where you're running, you know how you see on the emerge shows, everybody running. That part is true. The rest, not so much, but that part is true. So I ran into the resuscitation room. I went to the stable patient. I take down her monitor, throw everything on the stretcher, grab all her stuff, throw it on the stretcher, and I run down the hallway with the stretcher, run to the empty cubicle, threw the stretcher into the cubicle, hooked her back up again, and started to leave. As I'm leaving, she says, and I barely said anything to her because we get this, it's not nice, but we get this kind of mindset where we're so focused. And so I start to leave and she says, excuse me. So I turn around and I'm like, yes. And she says, I know you, but I just have one thing. She said, when you came and got me, she said, I noticed that you had a Star of David. And she said, and I thought to myself, is she Jewish? And she said, but as you were running down the hallway, she said, you hit the stretcher off the wall. And when you hit the stretcher off the wall, you said, oi. And so then I knew you were. And that was it. And that's the best way. I laughed and I said, yes, I am. And off I went. But that was enough for her. The fact that I bumped her and went, oi, that was enough for her. But does anybody have any questions, comments? This is, I'll tell you something. This is your chance, your opportunity to say anything, ask any questions. I won't cite your name in a future presentation. You can say whatever you want because I'm actually giving you permission to do so.
I have a question, Rivka. It's
Yes. Hi,
Janet.
Janet.
Have you ever thought to do a Jewish heritage trip to Jamaica?
All the time. I want to do a Jewish tour of the Caribbean. I want to do like an island hopping, go to the synagogues, go to the of the islands. Yes, indeed. One day I will. One day I will. When the executive director gig slows down a bit, then one day I will. But yeah, absolutely.
I have a question, Rivka.
Yes, yes, Adele.
I'm just wondering, when you started getting jobs in synagogues, did you find that there was a lot of prejudice? I mean, of course, you know, you're going to apply for a job and you're going to apply and they haven't seen you. And then you walk in and they're sort of like, we didn't expect you to be Black.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny. I came across my first job in a very interesting way. I used to work for City Shul, and that's Rabbi Elise Goldstein. And I had actually met her for the first time at North York General Hospital when I was a nurse. She came running up to me. I was at triage, and she came running up to me. And I guess at some point I must have been walking through the department. She spotted my Star of David. And she ran up to me and said, "Hi, I'm Rabbi Elise Goldstein. I happen to notice you're wearing a Star of David. Pleased to meet you." And she was like and then took off. And then I met her again at Darkade Noam briefly, and I said, "Do you remember me?" She looked at me, she said, "Of course I do. You were the," and then she took off. So when my name came up for the position, she already knew what I looked like because I reminded her. Then when I was sort of looking to branch out into different positions, I went through an employment agency. And who I love. She's an amazing, amazing woman. And she said to me, she said, "This is going to be really hard for me to say, Rivka." She said, "Our community isn't where it should be." And she said, as a Black person, as a Black Jew, as a Black person, she said, "You will find it challenging." She said, "It's sad to say, but you will find it challenging." And she is right, because we do have an unconscious bias of who we ourselves look like. And I'll tell you something, I did a test on unconscious bias. I hold those same biases because of how I grew up and because of what I saw as a kid and as a teenager and as a young adult as what is normal, right? So yeah, it's a challenge. And I never forget that when I walk into a Jewish space, because Jews of color will say to me, because it is actually unusual. I think I'm one of two, and there's only a recent hire, but I think I'm only one of two within the USCJ who is a Black executive director. I know within URJ, I was the only one. And so when I walk into a space, I still have that feeling because I still get the questions even within that space. And Jews of color will say to me, "Well, you know, it must be okay because you're doing this job and blah, blah, blah." And I'll say, don't kid yourself, because we still hold those. So I remember at a particular position, I was having a challenge with, the board, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was the rabbi who actually pointed it out to me because I was so upset. And the rabbi said to me, they said, "You know what? I think it's a racism problem, flat out. When the words come out of your mouth, they see the words coming out of your mouth." And she said, "It's automatically discredited." And and you do feel it. I almost feel it. Sometimes I have to be, my mother used to say that 3 strikes against you, Black, female, Jewish. You have to be not 3 times better. You almost have to be 1,000 times better, 3,000 times better. So I'm always very, very mindful of that. I know the head of the school, we were having a candid conversation about diversity. And she said to me, she said, you know, when people found out you got the position and your picture went around, she said, we had people say, oh, is it okay for her to be the executive director? Because don't you have to be Jewish? You know, and they were just like, but she is. So it's a thing. It is a thing.
Rivka, I was wondering in Black spaces if being Jewish has been something that's been an issue, if your Jewish identities come up in that way.
Yeah. You know, in Black spaces, sometimes they'll take people off guard. It will take people off guard because the automatic assumption is, especially, you know, even though the rich history of the Caribbean, the automatic assumption in Black spaces is that I'm Christian, right? But having said that, when they hear I'm Jewish, they're just like, oh. And some, if they're Jamaican, some will say, oh, okay, you know, and they just do it like that. And some who are especially fundamental Christians find it fascinating because I'm Jewish. And there are still others who, they're like, you're Jewish? Oh, no. You have to find Jesus. We got to help you find Jesus, you know? So it varies. But I'm also an undercover Jew in non-Jewish spaces, including Black spaces. So I have had to call out anti-Semitism within those spaces. And they'll be like, well, what do you, and they'll say, you're talking about me. You're talking about me. And it's been like, you know, so it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic because in some cases too, because there is also a mindset, she's Jewish, but she's Black within the Black community. I like to say I'm too Jewish to be Black, too Black to be Jewish. You know, so I fit in, but I don't fit in because even though we share the same hue, I am different. I may share some Jamaican stuff, but the Jewish part of me is me. So in that, I don't walk the same path. Yeah. The person who does my hair finds it really fascinating. She asks me questions every time I'm getting my hair done. She finds Judaism fascinating. She finds Israel fascinating. So, but generally well met. But I do know that I am an outsider sometimes there too, when they find out I'm Jewish. Definitely.
Rivka, how did you groom or prepare your kids to, I'm assuming your kids are of color as well?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my kids are biracial.
Okay. How did you help them based on what you experienced? How did you help them sort of deal with the differences that you experience and the challenges?
Yeah, it was tough. I definitely did a lot of encouraging them to stay strong and just realize that some people just don't know, but to really not it was hard. You know, it was hard because, and they went through different moments. It was hard in that when kids are already struggling with their identity anyways, and then there's this other layer on them. And yeah, my kids would sometimes come home very upset, but more so after a particular thing happened. So the reason I said my kids are biracial intentionally. I think when they first started going to Hebrew school, the assumption among other kids was, yes, they are brown. They're kind of a light brown. So their mother possibly is a white Jewish lady, right? So that was easy to digest. Things changed and my kids noticed. When I came to the school one time and all the kids were around and they found out that this person was their mother. And my kids said to me, then they started saying, but your mother's Black. I thought she was Jewish, like things like that. So it turned on them when the perception was, but I thought your mother was white. So yeah, you're Jewish, but now I see your mother's Black. We're not so sure anymore. My kids haven't removed themselves from Judaism, but I'd probably have to drag them kicking and screaming to synagogue. And they're 29 and 31. Every now and then my daughter will express an interest in going to synagogue, but then she's like, you know what, Mom, I don't think I can deal with the questions. She says, I can't deal with it, because they were of that age too. Thankfully, it's gotten better, but they were of, I like to say, the Drake generation, because they're right around the same age, grew up in the same area. And one of the sad things about the Drake experience, and if you go back and look at even interviews, you'll have to go back, I think, many years to find a first person interview of Drake talking about the Jewish community. Most articles are quotes from previous articles, not direct quotes from him. He has been quoted as saying the community, when he was growing up, was not welcoming to him as a Jew of color. You know, he was told that he'd never find anybody to marry. He was called the Yiddish equivalent of the N-word, you know. Yet the hypocrisy of us as a people is that we didn't embrace him at the time when Drake or Aubrey, just like my children, needed to be embraced the most. When you're growing up, when you're trying to figure out who you are, when you're trying to find your place in the community. We're now embracing him now when he is rich and famous and this and that. But think about it. How much, other than the odd video about his bar mitzvah, he doesn't really focus a lot on who he is as a Jew, or his booby. He talks about his booby. But do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad. And I think as a community, it's hypocritical of us. Embrace those who, instead of othering, we need to embrace, and not tolerate or not be hospitable. Just treat like how you would anybody else. Not any different, just as a fellow Jew. And you would be surprised how many people would still remain in the community, because that's what drives Jews of color out of the community. And there are some who will never come back. No matter how many times I say, oh, why don't you come with me? And they're like, no, scar's too deep. And you can't relax if you're on pins and needles. You know, and do my children experience a lot of prejudice? My children walk a really weird line. My son, my son is actually almost white passing. He gets a lot of people asking him if he's Spanish, this and that. But yeah, he's still been subjected to, especially when he will say, look, I'm Black, I'm biracial. My daughter has also. I have within our community, I've had, like I said, the microaggressions, but I've had people flat out, I've been called Schwarza, you know, I've had that. One of the reasons I decided to work and volunteer in the Jewish community actually is a direct result of my going to Israel. And I went to Israel in 2012, and I stayed there for almost a year. And I just sort of hung out, just traveled around, met a lot of people, just really hung out, went from top to bottom, east to west. And the one thing that struck me about Israel was that I never felt othered. I never did. The only thing they really found fascinating about me was the fact that I had Jamaican roots, because, you know, the whole Bob Marley thing, and that I was Canadian. That was the only thing that they were like, wow, you're Canadian, da, da, da. Nothing else mattered. One of my favorite Friday nights was when we were hanging about. I went to my friend Ronen's house, and at one point I looked around and I looked at us, and I said to Ronen, I said, look at us. I said, you're Indian. I said, I'm Canadian, but I'm Black, of Jamaican descent. I said, and then we have our Spanish Jew from Spain. I said, we have our Peruvian Jew, we had our Polish Jew, we had this like, this rainbow of us just sitting and hanging out on Friday night. And I said, this is how it is. This is how it should be. And that's what I wanted to, that when I came back, that's when I actually started not only working and volunteering in our community, I started doing a lot of Jewish diversity because I wanted Toronto to mirror Israel and the comfort level that I felt there and the diversity that I saw there. You know, we hear things about Israel, you know, being racist, and you will hear that. And I say to people, I said, I will never accept racism. I said, but I also won't paint a whole country as a racist country. I said, yes, there are racist people in Israel. There are racist people in Canada. There are racist people everywhere. There are racist people in countries in Africa. I said, they're everywhere. I said, but I will never call Israel a racist country. Sure, it makes its missteps, but it's also mindful of correcting its missteps. And I said, I've never felt more safe as a Black Jew than I did in Israel. And I said, that says a lot. I was synagogue hopping, nothing. It was like, it was amazing. And I really would love if our diaspora mirrored that. I'll touch on what really was awful this year, as you all know, unless you have another question. So what really did it for me, I'm used to walking in this skin. I'm used to dealing with microaggressions. I'm used to dealing with some overt and covert racism within our community. And when the George Floyd murder happened, as a Black person, and I hate to say this, it's not that I became numb to incidences. And because I'm attuned to them, you know, it's like, oh, this person, that person, but you sort of become not comfortable with it, but almost immune to the news coming out of the US, to a very small degree out of Canada, but definitely out of the US. George Floyd was different. And I think it was different, not just for me, I think it was different for everybody. Because in all the time doing this, and all the time being Rivka Campbell, I've never seen such an incredible outpouring of support from our community like I did now. And a desire to do better like I have now. And I think this is what it is. An activist in the United States said it was COVID. He said, because we couldn't look away. We were all at home. We didn't have the distractions of the Grammys or that, you know, we had zero distractions. So we were all pinpointed on news. And so that's why everybody saw it. And it wasn't just a blip. I deliberately did not watch the video. I just didn't want to. But then as I saw that the outcry and things are blowing up on social media within not just the Black community, the African-American, but the Jewish, everything. And I was like, what? So I watched it. And let me tell you, when I was watching it, it wasn't watching George Floyd. It was watching the police officer. And watching the police officer's face is what broke me. He said, if you had just seen him from here up, you would have thought he was waiting for a bus. You wouldn't realize that he was killing somebody. You would never have thought that. And I said it was the banality of evil. I was looking at the banality and it just boggled my mind. And I cried. I spent most of that day crying. Something in me broke and something in me got angry. It's like, enough. And something in me also realized I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. I wasn't going to tolerate it on the outside community, and I wasn't going to tolerate it within my Jewish family anymore. And I keep my Facebook kind of neutral. I just post jokes and fun stuff because everybody needs a happy place. So I don't often put politics or anything up there. And I started to post about being mindful of what's going on in the African American community, being mindful of what's going on in the Black Canadian community, being mindful of what's going on in our Jewish community and how we can do better. I unfriended a lot of Jews. I unfriended some Jews who I know in real life, who I had up to this point would say they are a friend of mine. And if not a friend, an acquaintance I knew very well. Because the vitriol that was spewing onto my screen from people who sure should know better. And I think that's the part that hurt me. We as Jews know what it's like to be hated for being who we are. We know what it's like to be othered. And to hear my fellow Jews saying to me things like, well, if you acted right, or if you weren't, and I said, what do you mean? You mean like sitting in a car reading a book? Where's the crime in that? And I said, regardless of the situation, no person should be judge, jury, and executioner. And it boggled my mind and how it shifted. And, and the other part was like, people were saying things like, well, we Jews stood up for Black people. And I would say to them, I said, okay, stop. If you mention marching with Martin Luther King Jr. 55 years ago, one more time, I'm going to snap like a psycho. That's 55 years ago. That was as long as I've been alive. You do not get credit in perpetuity for an act of a handful of Jews who weren't exactly accepted in the Jewish community for making that step 55 years ago. So don't rest on the laurels of people who are brave enough to walk with Martin Luther King Jr. What are you doing today? What are you doing today to not just make Black people comfortable, but those of us within your own community? You have to be mindful of how you treat us and be mindful of your unconscious bias. Be mindful of the word that is almost a trigger word for people, but be mindful of your privilege because you got it. You have the privilege. There is no such thing as driving while Jewish, but there definitely is driving while Black. If you walk in a store, you probably won't be followed. I have been followed in Canada and in the United States. And that is the very definition of privilege. It's not wealth. It's not status. It's about the ability to know that your skin color is not a factor in decision-making of others. And that is privilege. So it did change me.
Can I add in something there?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
I'm also a Jew of color.
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with some people within the Jewish community right after George Floyd, and they were trying to explain in very angry terms that it shouldn't really matter, or that the Jewish community doesn't need to stand up. Was basically what I was told, because we're persecuted too. Jews are persecuted too, so why do we need to stand up for the Black community? Was basically what was the crux of the conversation. And I asked this gentleman pretty point blank, and I was like, can I ask you a question? Can you hide being Jewish? Like in the end of every day, can you walk out of your house and does the grand world need to know that you're Jewish? And he was like, well, if I'm wearing my kippah, I was like, no, but you can put a hat over your kippah. You can tuck your tzitzits in. Like, the world doesn't need to know that you're Jewish. But that's a choice you make. Can I hide that I'm Black? Can I put this away? And he's like, no. I was like, so when I walk out of my house, in that moment, am I Black or am I Jewish?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Powerful.
I walk into the store, I'm not a Jewish woman.
You're a Black
Whether
woman.
the giant menorah around my neck says it or otherwise. In that moment, when I walk into someplace, I'm a Black woman walking into a store. And I have 100% been followed around And I agree with you 100%, Rivka. I unfollowed a lot of Jews.
A lot of people.
A lot of Jews after
lot of
George
Jews.
Floyd.
Yeah.
Because the vitriol and the hatred.
Yeah.
Because, and it's amazing to me the amount of people who forget in that moment that I'm a Black person. What was also most amazing to me is the lack of, like, I had people from random parts of my world check in on me, but I can tell you I had like a grand total of like 2 Jewish people check and see if I was okay.
Yeah.
It was such, especially since I'm so actively involved in the Jewish community, it took me actually yelling at somebody for them to understand that I needed help.
Yeah.
And it's your synagogue family, your mishpacha is supposed to be your family, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 And it hurts.
It hurts a lot.
It hurts deeper than people realize.
A lot.
Because it really does hurt. And I think it hurts because, like, you know, I said before, we of all people as Jews should know what it's like to be oppressed, what it's like to be hated. And I think the piece that we're missing is that the root of this hatred, the anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, branches of the same tree. Branches of the same tree. And we should be together fighting that trunk of white supremacy that is affecting both of us and affecting both of sides of me, so to speak. But we should be together in this. We should actually be natural allies. We should actually be natural allies. And when you realize that it's not that way, it's kind of a shock. You know, when people were like, you know, Black Lives Matter, and they would say, yeah, but, you know, Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic. And I'd say, stop right there. First of all, you're combining a statement with an organization. Yes, you can not support the organization. That is your right. There are Jews of color who do not support Black Lives Matter, the organization. But I said, why are you using that excuse to not support the fact that Black Lives Matter, the sentence? It's like all you're doing is showing me who you are because you're latching on this statement from an organization and using it as a justification to not support anti-racism efforts. You're using the riots and focusing on that and not hearing the helplessness behind those riots and not going to the truth of why those riots are happening. And it hurts. You know, I said to them, I said, there's a Zionist organization, and I am a mad, passionate Zionist. In fact, I intend to retire in Israel half-time at some point. I am a Zionist, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I said, there's this organization where a spokesperson for this organization has said some horrific things about Black people. I said, so would I now say, I am anti-Zionist because this organization has said bad things about Black people? I will instead say, not so keen on the organization, but I support Zionism. And I said, I don't understand how you can't, but then I said, yeah, I do understand why you can't divorce the statement from the organization, because you don't want to. You don't want to. You are content to keep your status quo and to justify why you don't feel the need to see change. And, you know, you do you, but you will not be doing you in my world, full stop. So it's been quite eye-opening for me, but, and Becca, and I hope you will see this, change is happening. Change is happening. And the change is giving me amazing feelings of hope for us as a people, We pride ourselves in whatever term you want to use, whether it's tikkun olam, we pride ourselves in being a light unto the nations and so on. Not recognizing that until we clean our own house, we can't help clean other people's houses. We have to clean our house first. And I see it. And I see the change that I see is that my Jewish community, our Jewish community, for the most part, are listening. They are not, they're listening and not saying yes, but, or yes, but we are. They are just listening. And, you know, one of the things like with the whole Black Lives Matter was yeah, but Jewish lives matter. But, and I would say to them, I say, what if there was a time in history where Jews are being persecuted? Jews are being persecuted by representatives of the government, being killed by representatives of the government. And a movement started that said, we have to stop this, Jewish lives matter. How would you feel if somebody said, while all this was going on, somebody said, yeah, but all lives matter? How would you feel? So remember that every time as Jews, when somebody says Black Lives Matter, and you say, but Jewish lives matter, think of that scenario. How would you feel if representatives of a government were persecuting Jews for being Jews and killing us? And a movement started that said Jewish lives matter, and somebody tried to counter it. And that's how it comes across. But again, I want to end on a positive note. I see huge growth within our community. And I see lasting things being put into place and a recognition that not about us without us. So people saying to myself and hopefully to Becca, what do you need from us? What not, here's what we're going to do for you. What do you need from us? And that is how you build change. And that is how we build our diversity. That is how we make ourselves stronger, bigger, because there's a lot of us out there. And just an amazing, amazing community.
Thank you very, very much, Rivka. This has been a wonderful presentation, wonderful evening. And I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. It's been a great turnout. I think we have a lot more to talk about this subject, but another time. So, thank you to Rivka, and thank you for clicking on tonight. And have a great evening and enjoy the rest of your week.
Can I just say one thing? If you want to get in touch with me privately, please feel free to do so. So feel free to give my email address out. I'm totally okay with that. And I'm happy, just give me a couple of days sometimes to answer. But definitely if there's something.
Your email on the
Sure.
chat? Okay.
Yeah, it's actually pretty easy.
Do you have any more quick, not questions, I was gonna say comments? Because I know it's been a long evening and we're all tired from the holidays.
But I thank you so much for listening. I thank you so much.
It's great. Thank you. And wish everyone well. And thank you for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
Night.
Great
program.
Thanks, Rivka, for joining us.
Thank you.
Adele,
You're
thank
welcome.
you and Beth Tikva Women for putting this together. It's
Thank you.
sorry, was it
Thank you,
Janet who was the one
everybody.
who
It
organized
was great.
Thank you. It was really great. So interesting. Really interesting and very engaging.
Program
Thank you, Rivka.
October, the end of October, and watch out for your next email because I will be contacting you that we have a program happening on October 20th and you'll get lots of information on that. So thank you for coming out tonight.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night. Good night. Thank you.
Tack så mycket.
Tack så mycket to everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the bathroom now. Okay, let's get this stupid sound.